Hello. Hi, everybody. So yeah, you're welcome. I love to see your faces. So if you're keen to keep your video on, that's great. I really love to see people's faces, and sometimes by the end, people are willing to share what they've created. But if you're not comfortable keeping your video on, that's a-okay too. I will introduce myself. So my name is Lauren Spring, and I'm an art educator with the Art Gallery of Ontario. And this is our senior social program for the end of July. I'm so glad that you're all joining us today. Oh, there's still some more coming. Hello. Hi, folks. Uh, what we're going to do is we're going to look actually today at two different works of art that in some ways are completely different from one another, but there's also some interesting sort of aesthetic and political overlaps that I think will be interesting for us to discuss, and then will inspire us to do some of our own art. The main activity for today is collage, and you can interpret that in whatever way you want to. There's no wrong material to be using here. A lot of people might be using photographs or magazines, newspaper, like words from cereal boxes, anything at all. I have a fun mix that I've set up here. But not to worry if you don't have anything yet. We'll first talk about the artworks, and then we'll move on to our own activity. I will also say that the session is 45 minutes long, so we'll go till 2:45. So we've got lots to discuss, lots to unpack, and lots to create in a short time. But I will keep it interactive, so please do, if I ask the group a question about your opinion or what you notice in the artworks, feel free to either unmute yourself and respond like that, or if you'd rather, you can always type into the chat. I have it open on my screen, and I'll be able to see what you're saying there too. So that's another option. And of course, if we were in person in the AGO, we'd be walking around together looking at these works of art and then heading down into the studio to create. But we're all in our respective homes today, and that is a-okay too. However, the AGO is now reopened. I'm very happy to say I got to go for the first time since November last week, and it was a real thrill. We have the Andy Warhol show on right now, so I had a really great time walking through there, and just being in the space again felt like a breath of fresh air. So yeah, those of you who are local to Toronto, just wanted to make sure that you're aware that it is open again now. But we know we've got lots of people joining from farther out too. All right, so I also just want to say a big thank you to Amica Senior Lifestyles, our lead sponsor for the Senior Social, for generously supporting this program. We're really, really grateful that we can all come together in these ways. Here's a beautiful photo of the Art Gallery of Ontario. Again, now reopened, and in addition to the about 90,000 works of art we have in our collection, it's also a real wonder of architecture. It was designed by world-famous architect Frank Gehry, and you can see part of his design right here. I'll also take a moment to acknowledge that the land the AGO is on is Mississauga territory, Mississauga. It is also governed by a treaty between the Mississauga of the Credit and the Canadian government. Toronto is Mississauga territory. It has also been occupied by other Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat confederacies. So here we go. The first work that we're going to be focusing on together today is this one. So it's actually, I suppose, what we consider an installation piece with a lot of different components to it. And before I share with you some of the things that I find most compelling about this work and the artist, in this case Bonnie Devine's sort of creative process and hopes for the piece, I'd like to hear from you what you notice going on here.
This reminds me of something my grandchildren recently did with all these little really tiny animals in the corner. Really interesting.
And was the one that your grandchildren did, was it sort of like a drawing, or was it kind of setting up with their toys, these animals all united together?
It was a drawing of different fruits, but they love colors, and the colors here and and they were tiny. The way they drew the fruit was very, very tiny, and the colors and the tiny animals reminded me of it.
Ah, I love that. Yeah, and there is something that's really sort of pleasing to the eye here, with these bright colors of these, obviously not correlated with reality, not seen too many blue buffalo, but yeah, the sort of brightness and kind of majesty almost of these creatures, or whimsy.
Yeah.
We also have in the chat, so idea of transformation. The objects and parts of the map seem to be escaping. Great. So yeah, there is some kind of story happening here. If we look on the wall, yeah, you can see there's a big map that might give us a hint to what's happening in this story. And certainly a kind of transformation theme, kind of things morphing into other things. Like one of our participants here noticed, yeah, all these animals seemingly running in the same direction, kind of gathered together. What else do folks see going on here? It might also be something you see, but you don't really know why you're drawn to it, or you really might wonder like what it is.
Well, the clothing looks like wings also because of having them close to the birds above. So you wouldn't normally you think that there may be a cloak or some kind of something that you would wear, but it has that appearance of wings as well, just because of its three-dimensional nature.
Yeah, very nicely said. I can see that too. And there's something really neat with the shadow play as well, right? Like the cloak here actually ends here, but then yeah, extends much like wings would, even beyond beyond its kind of physical limits here. Yeah, and a sense of movement that comes with that too. In the chat, yeah, there's also these kind of interesting sculptures in the middle that you might wonder, okay, how is this connected to the broader theme at play here, or the story that we might see on the wall? Yeah, and clearly, yeah, the animals here seem to be maybe running away from the map and towards these cloaks or these kind of wing-like things on the wall. Yeah, very nicely said. So this piece was made by Bonnie Devine, and she is a phenomenal contemporary artist. She also started up, and I believe is still the head of the Indigenous Culture Program at OCAD University in Toronto, just beside the AGO. And this was a really, really special piece. She basically, back in, I believe it was 2014, probably see the date right here. Yeah, 2014, 2015, for a 12-week period, two separate 6-week periods. She made this work in place. You can see it. She literally here is painted on the wall here, and sort of glued. It's hard to see from this particular image, but if we were to be able to show a detail of this, you would gather that this is actually beadwork that's on the wall here. So that's glued onto the wall. So she was actually on location in the gallery working on this, and she had a little sign set up basically saying, I'm an artist, I'm doing this installation. If you have any questions about it, like, let's have a conversation. And so in many ways it was both kind of, an installation piece, but also in some ways kind of performance art and public education all at the same time. And she was initially driven to create this piece because for a long time in the AGO's Canadian galleries in our McLean Centre, we had this map on the wall. Very colonial map, like you can see it's Upper Canada, Lower Canada, not much else, sort of two of the lakes, like there was a little bit of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario were on there, but really a lot missing in many ways. And Bonnie Devine herself is Indigenous, Ojibwe from Serpent River. And she, because she was frequently at the gallery, this map would always catch her eye. And she recalled thinking like, oh, like, why is this here? And like, that's not at all how she sees the land. Not at all how, given the choice, she would, depict it in an artistic setting. And so she thought, okay, given the opportunity, I'm going to shake things up a little bit here. And that's really what she wanted to do with this piece. I'm going to show you another angle of it here too. So this is the other wall. Knowing a little bit now about what I mentioned here about the map and Bonnie Devine's very different worldview than what was depicted in this map. Anyone have any ideas what these ships here might represent?
I'd say Christopher Columbus myself.
Good. And what makes you say that, you think?
Well, we had a beautiful, beautiful piece of land with lovely people, and then some European men came over and laid their influences on it.
Yeah, so certainly something here related to colonization, very different sort of worldview coming in here and making an imprint on this land that perhaps once was something very different. Oh, we've got some great comments in the chat here too. So the lighting plays an interesting role here. Directional lighting on the map, and also interesting shadows being cast below the center sculptures. Yeah, for sure. And all these things are taken into account in an installation piece for sure, right? Like kind of what angle is the light at and why. And we can see here, getting back to these ships, they are coming in from the east, sort of certainly from the direction of Europe, kind of arriving on the east coast of Canada. So yeah, I think in many ways, yeah, representing this colonial period. I'm just going to go back to this one here. One of the most kind of eye-catching components of this work to me are these really large figures here, these animal figures in kind of red and orange. Do they look familiar in any way to anyone, or does anyone have any idea kind of why they're here, what they might represent?
Well, one would be the buffalo or the bison that was probably slaughtered in mass numbers on the prairies. And I'm not sure about the other animals. I can't really tell, but I guess because one primary reason for profit in North America, what were the, beaver pelts and certainly the Hudson's Bay Company, and just that's how commercialism happened with Canada, particularly with animal pelts and wood.
Very nicely said. Yeah. So certainly harkening back to the history again, sort of maybe indigenous hunting practices based on survival, and then when Europeans came here, seeing more animals maybe more as commodity. And we know there's somebody else in the chat here, Carol is saying, it reminds me of Buffalo Jump in Alberta. Yeah, folks, it's a wild name for a town, huh? Some folks might have traveled there or heard of it. Head smashed in Buffalo Jump, an actual name of a place where, historically Indigenous people, that was one way they would sort of hunt buffalo en masse, would be to kind of have some other creature sort of drive them off the edge of this particular cliff. And then, generally the whole body would be used, right? The skin for clothing and housing, and the meat eaten, and the bones for tools and other things. And so very different relationship. And then, if we look back to the history of colonization too, how hunting took a very different shape. So some of those animals might harken back to those kinds of stories. And then I also see Robin here in the chat has said that they look like the Great Lakes. Yeah, if anyone was looking at these things like, this kind of setup arrangement reminds me of something. Bonnie Devine did want these to resemble the Great Lakes. Again, when she was walking by this colonial map in the gallery, the lakes were sort of cut off, right? There's only part of Lake Ontario, part of Lake Erie, and that was disturbing to her because she says that from an Indigenous perspective, the lakes are much more than commodity. They're much more than just sort of a topographical or whatever kind of representation on a map. They actually have their own energies, and that each lake has sort of its own kind of spirit animal, or its very own sort of energy to it. And so they're not just commodities or resources; they're living, breathing things on this that we share the planet with. And so she was reflecting on how that could potentially be communicated aesthetically, and so transform them into these really extraordinary animals that we can see here. And does anyone have any idea or any kind of reaction to these figures in the center here? Someone had mentioned in the chat about the interesting shadows, how that kind of brings them to life in a different way. Oh yeah, it can look kind of like weaving in some way. Robin is saying, yeah, that maybe the forests are witness. Yeah, there's definitely oh, I love that idea, huh? And that's often, when I'm out walking, I often reflect on how old so many of the trees are, and really think about what they've seen that no human who's alive today could have had access to. So I love that idea of the trees as witness to some of these atrocities and this violence and this big transformation. And there certainly are branches here, yeah, in the center. Uh, yeah, you can see wrinkles and folds. So they're not, yeah, they look like sort of traditional basket weaving in a way, but they take on these very different shapes and forms. And Bonnie Devine referred to these three figures as Anish Navitude, which has a nice kind of attitude to it. Um, kind of correlation to attitude and sort of how we might live in the world or view things or history. And they were actually, she gathered the branches from the center of these from three places that were very important to her. One was Serpent River, where she was born. Some of the other branches came from Walpole Island. And the other from the region of Mississauga of the New Credit, because it was those folks who signed the Toronto Purchase, which is very much, in line where the land that the AGO is standing on currently. Oh yeah, and someone is saying here in the chat that, yeah, there's an interesting kind of mirroring of these three figures, and then also these three cloaks on the wall that folks have noticed before. I think Bonnie Devine would likely be quite pleased to see that connection, or to hear that someone had made that connection. She had designed these three cloaks for kind of Indigenous heroes, for Tecumseh. One is for Tecumseh, one is for Crazy Horse, and one is for Pontiac, who all played very significant roles, essentially trying to protect the lands from either American expansion or other forces. And she said that she liked the idea that if these three kind of Indigenous heroes were to come back to life right now in physical form, they'd have these cloaks sort of waiting for them. They could just sort of run into the gallery, pick them up, and continue on. So this interesting sense of movement. And then, yeah, I think these figures here in this kind of Anish Navitude is maybe, yeah, what we might want to spark in people today to continue that kind of fight, and what's going on in different regions of this country today. There's also, it's a little bit hard to see, but on the wall here where I'm pointing my little mouse cursor here, Bonnie Devine has also collaged part of this wall. She's taken different pages, primarily out of textbooks, like Canadian history textbooks, like the one that she would have encountered going through the school system in Ontario, where there's, for a long time, there's been a certain narrative about the War of 1812, about ideas of colonization and the history of this land, that she certainly reads and finds highly problematic, and I imagine many of us would too. Ways that certain figures like Tecumseh have been framed. And so she kind of ripped these pages out and has highlighted certain parts of them and has put different images on top to juxtapose kind of what's being told in the history textbooks with her own perspective or other sides to the story, which is really quite a powerful way of approaching this mass installation too. And someone else in the chat here is saying, so Bonnie Devine could have done all this on a flat wall, but putting it in a space that turns and changes directions makes the whole thing seem 3D or even more immersive. I really like that interpretation. Yeah, that if you're in here, if you're in the gallery space, you're kind of engulfed in it. You're sort of taken up by this history, which is, essentially true. All of us who were born here, who have immigrated here, this is in many ways part of our inherited history. Are there other thoughts or questions about this piece before we take a look at the next one?
Is this one still on at the gallery? Can we still
Great.
see it?
Yeah, great question. And I wish it was. When it was there, first kind of installed in 2014, 2015, I hoped it would last forever because it really added a lot to this particular space. But unfortunately not, no. And that's the trouble sometimes with installation art, and that's also in this case kind of part performance art, part public education, is that it only lives on in these pictures now. We have the cloaks and other aspects, but the beautiful painting on the wall is we're not able to see that in the actual space right now. All right, so let's take a look at the next piece. So this is by an artist named Wardell Milan. And again, before I share with you some of the things that I find most interesting about this work and feelings I have when I look at it, I'd be curious to hear from you what you notice going on here. Kind of what grabs your attention right away, what makes you maybe feel excited or uneasy or anything at all. So someone in the chat is saying there's a sense of sadness here. Yeah, that perhaps clearly it's a portrait, and in some ways, profile, in some ways kind of face on. And there's lots of eyes. Yeah, Robin is saying maybe searching eyes. And then this blue, so yeah, maybe kind of pooling tears. Certainly, it seems that might come into play, sort of melancholy or sadness or introspection. Carol here is saying, yeah, there are eyes that they're staring at me, but also looking away, and that makes it very unnerving. Yeah, I agree with you that, it would be a very different image here if we didn't have the drawn parts, which is already quite neat when we think about collage. Often, it's just sort of one medium. Here, just like Bonnie Devine's, it's multimedia, and Wardell Milan has actually done some drawing on top of this profile picture. And so we have these eyes looking right out at us, but clearly also having something else going on underneath. And I wonder, so Carol's saying it's unnerving. I wonder what about these eyes looking at us makes you feel that it's unnerving. And another great question here too from Robin, who is Michael Ross? So this is quite key, and perhaps a little bit of the artist Wardell Milan's biography is helpful here too. So he is an African American, primarily based in New York City, and he is also gay, and has throughout sort of becoming a professional artist and much of his work, he actually sort of deals with these aspects of his identity, being homosexual, being Black in America. And so Michael Ross was a model who modeled for Robert Mapplethorpe's book back in, I think it was 1986, called The Black Book. So again, a little bit more background here. So Robert Mapplethorpe was a photographer. Some of you might know the music or the art of Patti Smith. Some really beautiful songs, and wild, really interesting and wild life. And in the 70s, she was living in New York City, and she and Robert Mapplethorpe were really, really close friends. They lived together from time to time, were sort of romantic partners as he was coming to terms with his own sexuality. And he ended up becoming a very, very famous photographer, doing really beautiful images, in many cases of bodies. And in 86, I believe it was 86, he published this book called The Black Book, where he had hired African American male models to pose for him in sort of very highly erotic ways. And it's hard to look at the book and not recognize the beauty of the bodies and of the photography, the black and white photography itself. There's something sort of, very, very erotic about it, really sort of charged and intense. But from, a 2020 or, 21st century vantage point, in some ways it's quite problematic too. And so Wardell Milan, as an African-American homosexual himself, looks at this book and often thinks, okay, there's lots of questions about these anonymous models. And Michael Ross was one of those models. And so he's, I suppose, questioning things like, what really did they consent to? How much were they paid? How did they feel about the positions that they were in? Were their bodies sort of being fetishized in some way? In some cases in the Black Book, you have like sort of full bodies and these beautiful poses of backs and legs. And in other cases, it's just sort of fragmented body parts too. So you don't really know which model it belongs to, and it's just an elbow or a back or a corner of a shoulder. And so Wardell Milan, I think, is in this particular piece meditating on a lot of that, and then thinking about, and who really was Michael Ross? Like what was his identity? We know him primarily from this book and other modeling, but how might he have felt about it? That kind of thing. And we have this response here from Carol to my earlier question, sort of why these eyes looking out at us are unnerving. And she says that they're very direct. Yeah, they're very direct in their gaze. It certainly kind of breaks the fourth wall in a way. I think whenever we have some sort of figure in a work looking right at us as the viewer, it does something, right? We're sort of like, oh, all of a sudden we're kind of part of this experience in a way that is not necessarily true if we're looking at just someone in profile who doesn't seem to see us, or a landscape where we're kind of implicated here. Yeah, and Carol's saying, it kind of challenges the viewer. Yeah, and maybe brings up some of those questions I was mentioning, sort of, okay, if this is what Wardell Milan has been realizing or wondering about Michael Ross's past and Robert Mapplethorpe and the Black Book in general, maybe it's challenging us to think about representation today in media, in art, in our everyday lives. So I like that kind of challenge. Someone else in the chat here is saying there's familiar features of a face, but then there's that sense of being chopped up or cut apart. It says this piece uses gelatin silver prints. What are those? Oh yeah, that's a kind of photograph. Great question. So again, that kind of multimedia nature here. So actual photography and prints, and then drawing on top. Yeah, and that sense of being chalked up. I mean, I've read a lot about feminist theory and kind of the male gaze throughout art history and advertising and media today, everywhere in popular culture, and that's something that frequently comes up too. How you have a lipstick ad and it's a woman's just kind of red lipstick mouth, and so you don't know anything else about her identity or anything at all, or parts of the body that seem to be more sexualized or fetishized than others. So I think that fragmentation is often problematic when we're thinking about representation. Are there any other thoughts or questions about this work before we move on to doing some of our own creation? All right, well, in that case, I'm going to share my screen differently here. And I'm curious, while I do that, maybe folks can let me know what materials did you have ready here? Do you have magazines, newspapers? Here's mine. We'll certainly need scissors and glue. And in the prompt online, what I had suggested, obviously we're going to be doing some sort of collage, but one thing I had suggested too was to, much like Bonnie Devine did with the history of colonization in this country and Indigenous representation and rights, and Wardell Milan was doing with sort of Black and LGBTQ plus identity. Are there any issues that you feel politically right now? Okay, if I were going to make some art like this, instead of just randomly placing pieces in a collage because they sort of look interesting, are there any issues that you feel would be important to explore? What do folks think when you're watching the news, when you're just going about your everyday life? What sort of social justice issues really kind of tug on your heartstrings, or, you know?
I think it's in general a much more public acceptance of concerns about mental illness, where you have many, I guess, celebrities, particularly in the sports realm, acknowledging the pressure and I guess coming out. And of course, we also know that there's a sort of another pandemic as an echo with the COVID, with mental illness. So I think it's just that awareness of how these times are hard on people, and we probably should be acknowledging it.
Yeah, very nicely said. And I think you're right. I mean, over the past, what are we, 17 months into this now? I've lost track. But yeah, I think that's really come to the fore. Even people who maybe felt they themselves hadn't had too many mental health struggles have encountered them during the pandemic, certainly seen loved ones struggle in different ways. So yeah, I'd say that's a topic that would likely be front of mind and feeling for many, for sure. And then you're right, yeah, with the Olympics too, and some recent kind of sports figures, and just, yeah, recognizing that humanity and how lifey life is, even if you're rich and famous and, you know, really talented, how you can't escape things like that. Yeah, that would be a beautiful sort of theme to take on in collage, and could probably find a lot of good images, and certainly Olympic related in newspapers this week. How about other folks? Are there any other kind of, yeah, big political issues or social justice issues that have ignited this kind of fire in your belly recently? Well, I'll share one with you for me, and it's somewhat related to what Janet was talking about too. I have a little 3-year-old daughter, and I think I'm a little bit sort of, well, very hyper conscious these days of kind of what narratives she consumes in shows she watches or in media that we see all around. She has lots of questions when we walk past a big billboard like, Mama, like, why is that person looking down at her knee? And she's a little young for me to explain the whole history of the male gaze and why a certain female model selling pajamas would be positioned in a certain way. And but the questions are there, and so I've been really, really conscious of that and different messaging that she gets, and narratives that I tell, and the way I live my life and set an example. So I think in my collage, I'll explore some issues related to that. I've cut up a few different pieces that I found so far, and again, mine are a combination of words that I found in different newspapers, and also pictures. I found this great one of Ruth Bader Ginsburg that I think might be a neat part of the story that I'm going to tell. So if you have some things with you, just take a look. It's one of my favorite things about doing collage is that it really can be meditative in many ways, and you might have a general theme like I do of sort of women's rights and what it's like to be a young girl in this world, navigating messaging coming at you from left, right, and center, and then you just look through what you have and start to piece it together. There's often kind of happy surprises if you just open a book or a magazine that tend to pop out. So I like that, kind of leaving it up to chance or magic there too. And if you're looking at your page, looking at the things you have to cut up, and you're thinking, oh, I don't have a burning political issue or anything, that's totally fine. Sometimes what's fun in collage too is just kind of juxtaposing different sizes of people, or different colors that you find interesting in whatever you're looking at too. That's fine. You might also want to take some inspiration from Wardell Milan and do more of a portrait type thing. If you have some of your own photography, like pictures of yourself that you're willing to cut up, different parts of your face or fragments of who you are and lay that out. I really liked what Janet was saying too, in terms of when we think about portraiture, we tend to think about the physical outward appearance, but what if you were to do sort of a self-portrait with the colors and the feelings and all of the complicated things sort of swirling around in your mind and body too? How might you represent that? So yeah, we can get started. I'm gonna carefully place mine, and I'm gonna find a few more pieces as we go too. Feel free, if at any point you have something you want to share or show us, a question or a neat discovery that you've made, feel free to chime in and let us know what you're thinking. I also have some of my daughter's magazines here because I thought, since I'm looking at sort of girlhood, womanhood, femininity over generations, it might be fun to incorporate some things from kids' books or magazines too. I'm inspired by Wardell Milan and his eyes. I think I might do something neat here too with different types of eyes. Might play around a little bit with this one and kind of fragment the body, add a little bit more of some features. Here too. Anybody made any neat discoveries yet? Any pieces there that come from very different places that maybe you're quite happy or now brought together in your work? Went to a pages. What I like to do when doing collage is make sure I'm really happy with the setup before I actually glue anything down. I feel like I'm getting somewhere with this face here, but I'm going to make sure I've got all the pieces. All right, well, we're almost at our time today. Would anyone like to share anything that they've come up with so far? If not, that's fine too. It is really one of my favorite mediums to work in. And so you're welcome to share it on social media. And if you create something and you want the world to see it, I'd certainly be happy to check in and see some of these issues, maybe some of these just happy accidents you came up with when you were putting different elements together. So totally up to you. But yeah, we'll wrap up our session there today. I'm going to continue working on mine and might share it online when I'm finished. And I want to thank you all for joining today and for your insights and your questions. I had a really nice time gathering with you here. And stay tuned because there will be more senior socials coming in the coming weeks. So do just keep referring back to the website and details will be there. Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon. Happy collaging.